Hi, this is Ian Anderson of Jethro Tull, and you're listening to Retrospectives with John Broughton on 3SER Casey Radio.
In the shuffling madness of the locomotive brass.
Since I'm 40 years of Jethro Tull.
Well, thank you too. It's a bit like congratulating me on a 60th birthday, or the fact that I have no hair and I've extra couple of inches around the tummy. It's not something to be proud of, just something you have to put up with, really. But thank you for the thought.
If the Ian Anderson of today could sit down and have a chat with Ian Anderson in 1968, what advice would he give him?
Oh, well, probably just pipe down a bit. You know, I think on the rare occasions I see some footage of me, I mean, not performing on stage so much, but just, in an interview or something, I always think, oh God, it's a bit self-assured and pompous sounding, but I probably do today. I just I'm pompous, but with more authority and more experience. But I think in many ways, be quieter, sit back, observe, listen, rather than being quite as energetic and forward. But that's probably the way I came across more in public. I think I've always been rather a private person most of the time, more of a solitary person most of the time. It's just that, when you are thrust into the public eye, whether it's for a television interview or for a concert performance, you tend to bring out resources that you don't utilize during the greater and more private part of your life. So it's a bit exaggerated, perhaps.
Now, I believe you're not a nostalgic kind of guy, but do anniversaries like this bring out some sort of nostalgic element within you?
What it brings out, really, is a focus on the benchmarks, musically speaking, of what we've done in the past. I think that's the constructive part of accepting the small value attached to 40 years as a convenient number with a zero on the end, but it is really focusing on the benchmarks, the musical benchmarks, the things that were pretty good, the things that were the kind of special moments along the way. And although we took the decision early this year in 2008 to concentrate in our concerts this year really mostly on the first very few albums, 68 through 70, 72, 73, 74 period. That was always the intent, just to make it, focus on the music that for most people in the countries where we're known represents Jethro Tull as they first came across it. So in the UK there was a lot of material from the very first album, and in America, more from the second and third and fourth albums. But we've just tried to give people that flavour. So I guess amongst the oldest members of the audience, it's the stuff they heard us play first time they ever saw us live. And for the younger generation that are there, it's the stuff that perhaps is maybe for them maybe a little interesting because it's what their parents first heard, and part of the flush of youth and anticipation of new music that their parents enjoyed. So I think it has that value to look at that, and looking along the way at later decades, as I personally do, whether I'm playing those songs on stage or not, it brings that sense of scrutiny, I think, on the ups and downs of it all. But it is on a musical level. I mean, that's it. It doesn't mean anything to me in terms of emotional moments or nostalgia. I'm not a nostalgic guy. Indeed, it's very difficult to be nostalgic about a song from 1969 when you've been playing it every night for the last week in 2008. It's not nostalgic. You can't be nostalgic about something that's 24 hours ago.
That's true.
When it comes to doing it on stage. So nostalgia doesn't really ever enter into it for me at all. And I'm not one who tends to dwell on the remember the time when kind of stories that you might indulge in over a cold beer after a show or something. I mean, it's not that it never crops up, but we don't really very often sit around and talk about old times. I mean, maybe once a year it might come up in conversation. But, I think we have our private memories, and that's it. We don't really revel in that stuff, and not having been part of the rock and roll, you know, the scene, the subculture amongst musicians and peer group musicians of the day, we weren't part of that group, that clique of people who did all that stuff together. You know, we didn't mix with other bands or musicians or whatever. We were all rather private individuals off stage, and I think there was only really kind of one party goer, well, maybe two, in the band. And they were both bass players. Actually, three, and they were all bass players. Bass players, for some reason, either seem to be incredibly reclusive, like Jeffrey Hammond, or complete manic, over-the-top guys, like dear old Dave Pegg, our bass player from the 80s and 90s.
Now, I guess this year had to do the interview circuit, being the 40th anniversary, and I noticed on your website you've put up a mock interview answering a bunch of those all too often asked questions. How effective a tool has that been in preventing media people like myself asking those all too often asked questions?
Well, it's not that I mind answering them at all, especially, you know, if it's radio or television media, but for the print media, it seems rather redundant when they can find the answers to that stuff and simply, you know, highlight, copy, paste, rather than wasting precious time in an allotted interview by going over that ground. You know, I'm not going to change my story substantially.
Yeah.
And so it really is, it's actually, our website began not as a thing to serve the curiosity of our fans, but really as a bridge between Jethro Tull and the media. It was primarily the reason for having the website then, back in 1999, I think it was, and now it's primarily directed towards information for media, to give them the tools with which to write about the band, find photographs, get lots of information, some of it anecdotal, some of it purely factual, some of it humorous, some of it serious. It's that's the main reason. I think it's useful, obviously, for fans who want to know where we're playing and or some current bit of news or advice or something. But I've always seen it as being a bridge to the media, really. So I'm just there to make things easier for you guys.
Do you remember having an initial blueprint for the sound of the band? Or was that something just...
Well, my own personal blueprint was always that really of acoustic music, because when I was a teenager, I grew up listening to acoustic folk blues, work of Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee, and some of the more acoustic blues musicians of North America. A degree of jazz, which is essentially acoustic music, and then later on classical music and folk music and some church music and stuff it's definitely the common thread is it's acoustic. It's played by real people with real instruments, and they don't have to plug them into the wall to make them work, or start hooking them up to computers to make them work. So my interest has always been, and if there was a blueprint, it's to try to make acoustic music be, if not at the center, a strong companion in the otherwise electrified world of amplified music in which I've been working for 40 years. So, it's not that I'm averse to electric music. I just like to try and keep in touch with the acoustic side of it and the more ethnic side of it, because I've always been fascinated by music from different cultures, different periods of history, different countries, different religions, just different people. It's something that I don't fall in love with African music or Indian music. But I'm interested in trying to touch it, trying to feel it, try to be moved by it, and sometimes to some degree to incorporate elements of it into the music that I write. But just as I could never be a blues musician because I'm not black, I'm a lower middle class white kid. I've never picked cotton in my life, and I certainly have no intention of doing it. And so I don't have those credentials that were definitely the credentials of some of my musical inspirations back in my teenage years. I don't have that credibility of being a black man in a black man's world with all of the tensions and racial issues surrounding blacks and black America, particularly in the 60s, which was, as you know, a time when there were some pretty serious confrontations between white and black America. Indeed, one of my favorite musicians of that era, when I was a teenager, was a guy called J.B. Lenoir, who was one of the very few black American blues singers to actually touch upon and sing about racial issues and racial tensions. And so I felt that that was kind of my world, but not my world, not one that I could ever belong to, but I could learn from it. I could try to learn the sensitivity to feel emotion from it, but I always knew I could never really belong to it, and I feel the same way about other ethnic music forms today. I'm playing some concerts with an Indian artist, Indian American artist called Anushka Shankar, who I believe played a few months ago at Sydney Opera House. She's kind of our guest on some Indian dates we're doing, and so working with sitar and writing music for sitar and flute is an interesting challenge, but it's not going to leave me, I'm sure, at the end of 6 days of concerts with her thinking, wow, I'm going to spend the rest of my life writing music for sitar and flute, and I shall probably be glad not to hear sitar again after 6 nights of it, and she'll probably never want to hear a Western flute as long as she lives. But, for 6 nights, we will try to make it work.
Have outside projects like that helped you maintain an enthusiasm for the band when you return to it?
I think so, yes. It is, absence makes the heart grow fonder in many ways, and it is sometimes after a couple of weeks off the road that, you're really excited about doing it again. I'm kind of in the middle of a period of 4 weeks between tours, and that's as long off as I've had for all the year. And it's weird, I feel kind of dislocated because it's 4 weeks go by and I haven't actually played a concert. So that's a little strange. That takes getting used to. But I anticipate eagerly, more concerts, and partly because it's a healthy thing to do. I'm more physically fit and more engaged when I'm doing concerts, especially because sometimes they're quite demanding physically, either incredibly hot or incredibly cold or incredibly wet or incredibly dry. It's never what you want. It's always presents physical challenges, but I think I rather enjoy that, especially at my age. It's a way of keeping in shape and keeping engaged. I do look forward to it, and doing things musically outside of the orbit of Jethro Tull is also satisfying, not only for me but for the other guys in the band. A couple of them are teachers when they're not with Jethro Tull, and they do they have proper teaching roles, and a couple of the guys play with other artists or do solo things, and as do I. So I guess it's all quite healthy. It's not like keeping a mistress. It's not quite like that. It's not about a sort of an alternative, secret sort of dark alternative. It's just something that I think just allows you to exercise a part of your mind in a way that maybe is a little more selfish, a little bit more self-serving in terms of ambition, rather than necessarily taking into account other people and their preferences and their timetables and their ways of playing. So I quite enjoy it, but I don't think it's not a dark secret to nip off and do a couple of solo dates. It's something that we all know we do, and we all, I think, respect and rather like the idea that we can all have that little part of our lives to do different things and then come back together again and play together.
Now, the band's had its fair share of lineup changes through the years, but it's never given the impression of destabilising the band at any stage. To the outside observer, it's always seemed a smooth transition. What qualities do you look for in musicians, or have you looked for over the years in musicians to join the band?
Well, they've got to be old and ugly. I mean, I play with some whippersnappers when I do solo concerts, and sometimes when I do orchestral shows, there are a lot of folks in the orchestra who are, a third of my age, or certainly half of it. But musicians really doing the Jethro Tull stuff, they have to. It's not that they have to be necessarily old, but they probably will be. They will be at least middle-aged if they've got the experience and the personal history of being able to cope with the enormity of all that musical style and reference that comes with the repertoire. So chances are they're going to be pretty experienced, established musicians to be able to do that. But the core of Jethro Tull is me being the original founding member, and Martin Barr, who joined after a year. And Don Perry, our drummer, has been with us for 24, 25 years. And the other two guys are people that I've been playing with for about 6 years doing solo concerts, but have become the Jethro Tull keyboard player and bass player in the last year or so, because I was playing with them so much doing solo shows and acoustic shows that when they overlapped with Jethro Tull tours, it made sense to have the same musicians. So it is, the lineup changes are unfortunately necessary sometimes for a variety of reasons, and indeed my son James plays drums sometimes with Jethro Tull when Don Perry's either had some health problems or if they're just a couple of shows and it's not worth him coming all the way from Los Angeles just to play a couple of shows in Sweden or something. So, there are various stand-ins. I have a young German guitar player who plays with me on solo shows, has also covered for Martin Barr a couple of times when Martin had to have surgery on an occasion, and young Florian came to play guitar with us for a few shows. So, yeah, you've got to have, it's a bit like having a football team. You've got your A team, but sometimes somebody gets injured and you have to field a different person. Yeah. And you hope that the person who gets injured is not me, because I'm kind of difficult to replace.
Yeah, that's a nice way of putting it. But your stage persona, has that changed much over the years? Do you think, have you consciously gone about changing it at all?
Well, I think that there are elements of things that you do when you're learning to present yourself on stage that are a bit tentative, but they're also perhaps brave and maybe a little crazy, and it comes with the territory of youth. As you get older, you find yourself perhaps relaxing a bit more on stage and having a degree of banter and cheerful presentation to the audience, and that obviously works better with an English-speaking audience than it works in Poland, where you've got to be pretty simple and very clear and well-spoken. If you're going to speak English at a non-native English-speaking audience, it helps if you have the clarity of a BBC announcer as opposed to mumbling into your beard like Amy Winehouse. Not that I know she's got a beard, but she probably will have. It's presentation is presentation. I don't deliberately try to change it, but I'm sure it's evolved into something a little more laid back, a little more cynical, a little more whimsical, a mixture of humor and little anger slips in there from time to time. Not aimed at the audience, just so I present myself, I think, according to the songs. Some of the songs are angry songs, and I feel they have to have an angry performance. And I remember playing with a principal violinist in an orchestra who used to smile at me all the way through one of my angry songs, and I repeatedly tried to say to her, "Look, I know that your instinct is to smile, but please don't smile during the song, because it's an angry, serious song." And she was a devout Christian and found it very difficult to really kind of understand lyrically where I was coming from and why I was passionate and angry about this subject matter. And in a sense of almost bewilderment, she couldn't do anything except smile at me. And I found it really distressing. I mean, really, it made me not angry that she was doing it, but it disturbed me a lot, because sometimes, it almost feels like someone's diluting it. Someone's trying to dilute your passion by giving you the wrong sort of feedback. And when anger is anger. You can turn it into a constructive and creative way, but you've got to feel that passion. And some passion is angry. I mean, Jesus Christ got angry. The Old Testament's full of a lot of anger, and but these are our holy books. And so you must, I think, sometimes accept that that anger and passion have to be reined in and controlled, and they have to be given a constructive direction. But it's part of presentation for me on stage. It was obviously a big part of presentation for bands like The Who, and then the Sex Pistols or whatever. I mean, anger is there.
Yeah.
But it can be destructive, and it can give the wrong impression, and it can create a lot of unfortunate misinterpretation by gullible young people, and sometimes, it can be, it can be sending the wrong message. And indeed, a lot of bands who have been accused of giving that wrong message, everybody from Black Sabbath in its early days to bands like Slipknot in America. It's easy to perhaps develop a stage persona, which is probably mostly showbiz, really. It's not really who these people are, but
yeah.
It's a way of presenting themselves. But what we don't want is people, young people taking it too literally, and then self-combusting, as it were, in sort of imitation of what they think their musical hero is about. So ultimately, stage presentation is just that. But to an extent, you've got to get inside the musical character that's applicable to each song, and try to live that out for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 10 minutes, or whatever it is that song lasts on stage. And I think that's part of the performance. Why performance, obviously, is rather enjoyable to do. That you do step into this applicable persona, and you don't have to stay in it too long. Unlike an actor in a Shakespearean play, and it goes on for 2 hours. You've got to stay in character. And some actors who remain in character, for making a whole movie, or or partly stay in character for a whole run of a stage play, because they're scared to slip out of it back to the real world. But that's not a problem for guys like me. We're chameleons.
Mm-hmm. And during that very successful period in the 70s, you were putting out concept albums such as Thick as a Brick. Many defined the band as being part of that whole progressive rock genre. Was that a categorization that you were comfortable with at the time?
Well, when we made a prog rock album in '72, Thick as a Brick, it was a spoof. It was supposed to be a send-up, really, of the prog rock and the concept album genre. And we were having a little fun with it. This was the era of Monty Python. I can remember arriving in Australia and having a press conference at the airport, and we got off the plane wearing these sort of long riding macks and flat hat Anderson Tartan caps and tracksuits underneath, and I guess we looked pretty weird. We it was we were all identically dressed and were seemed to be very strange characters, and it certainly amused and bemused the Australians. The first sight of Jethro Tull, but that was just the character of that album. It was supposed to be kind of weird and a little surreal. That was that went with the performance of the album. But it was not supposed to be serious. It was a little nerve-wracking that probably. I think in England everybody got the joke. I would like to think in Australia probably most people got the joke. In America maybe half the people got the joke. In Japan no one got the joke. So the worry was that you were doing this thing which was kind of tongue-in-cheek, slightly satirical kind of performance, but to some people they thought it was the real deal. They thought it was they took it verbatim, and that was a little worrying, because I didn't really want people to think that we were that sort of a band. We were having a little fun with it, but I don't think Jethro Tull qualify in the prog rock stakes in the same way as Yes or Emerson, Lake and Palmer
no, not at all.
did.
A lot of people also found it strange that you wound up with a Grammy for the best heavy metal and hard rock performers. How did you take that at the time?
I think it was a Grammy not for being the best hard rock /stroke metal album, but it was a Grammy award for a bunch of okay guys who'd never won a Grammy before, because the 5,000 and some voting members of the National Academy of Recording Arts and Sciences, had a soft spot for old Jethro, and probably thought, well, these guys have never won a Grammy, and here they are nominated in an unlikely category, but, well, we'll give them the Grammy because they haven't got one. I thought that was crumbs from the table, gratefully received. And Metallica, who didn't win the Grammy and were the hot tip for the Grammy, at least had the humour to take out a full-page ad in Billboard the following year when they did win a Grammy. They thanked Jethro Tull, amongst the record producer, the agents, the managers, the record company, the parents, the family dog, and Jethro Tull for not bringing out an album that year. So even the darkest of metal folks sometimes show a little sense of humour.
Such thing as a typical Jethro Tull fan, are you able to generalise and describe one?
Happily, I'm not. And that's one of the things that is one of the good things about Jethro Tull, is that it is just a plethora of human type and forms. I mean, we don't get very many black people in our audience. That's pretty rare. But we get a lot of Asians, a lot of Indians. We get a lot of people who perhaps come from the professions, people who are doctors and lawyers and airline pilots. But we also have quite a following amongst, really quite working class, down-to-earth people from provincial towns in England who, it's absolutely across the board. I mean, it's an extraordinary and very diverse audience. It's one of the things that makes me happy is that we don't have this uniformed, predominantly male, fist-clenching heavy metal audience the way that some bands have. I would hate that. I mean, I'm used to seeing boy, girl, boy, girl, boy, girl. Well, boy, girl, mum, dad, grandpa, grandma, whatever it is. But it's a wide age group, and it's very much mixed gender. We don't generally appeal, I think, to the gay community particularly, and we don't appeal to the black community. But Asians seem to quite like Jethro Tull. There are always lots of Indian folks in our shows.
What, apart from experience, what qualities do you think the band has now that it didn't have, say, back in the glory days of the 70s?
Well, some finesse, because I think as you get older, there are some of your attributes will start to fail you as a performer, just due to age and wear and tear. But you can, on the other hand, compensate by sharpening up in some areas of your performance and your musical creativity. So I guess the thing for me probably mostly is to try to improve as a flute player, because having been known as the main, if not the only, flute player in rock to most people, it was on the basis of it being, not terribly simplistic, but, I played the flute, but I was thinking guitar, because guitar was my first instrument, so I had no tuition in the flute. I just tried to play on the flute the kind of things I would play on the guitar if I was playing a solo or a riff. So that was my starting point for playing the flute. But around the transition from the 80s to the 90s, I started to try to, play flute while I was thinking flute. And I spent more time, particularly in the early 90s, trying to learn to play the flute, not from scratch, but I adopted all the correct fingering techniques for the flute, and I tried to learn a little bit more about tone production and making the flute work for me in terms of its to expand as far as possible on its on the dynamics of the instrument and the tonal quality, the forms of expression, you know. So I just try to broaden my flute playing, and I've certainly become a much better flute player in the last 10 years than I was. My guitar playing probably stays pretty much on a par. I could do stuff that I've always done on the guitar. As a singer, I've always been an uncomfortable singer and never a natural one, so it's always been a bit of a struggle for me. And some songs I find I do them okay. I sing them in the original key, just as they always were. Other songs I in company with most of folks of my age, you know, I have to drop them a couple of semitones to accommodate the deepening of the male voice that comes with age. I mean, we all know the terrible difficulties faced by Frank Sinatra in his later years, of Pavarotti and his ironically, poor Pavarotti, during almost all the time that he became widely known as a worldwide great opera singer, he was on the decline. His glory days and his best of his voice was behind him, and yet he only became internationally hugely successful at a point when he was past his best. And the descent of Pavarotti into the final performances, and his very last performance, he actually lip synced. He couldn't make it. He had to lip sync to a pre-recorded track on a big major TV show, and that must have been an awful way to end a career, really. But it happens, and to some extent you learn to cope with it. I know some singers who've totally lost it, and I know some singers who are miraculously still in possession of almost their full capabilities. Some get lucky, some don't. Some bring it upon themselves. Some just don't have that within them to stay at a peak for very long. And that applies whether you're a tennis player, a Formula One racing driver, a cricketer, or a singer. Some folks get lucky and have longer careers than others. I think that's partly genetic, partly you can extend your professional life a bit with some lifestyle changes and exercise and all that sort of stuff. But there are some folks who are just blessed with this ability to go on, which is extremely annoying.
When you're putting a set list together these days, how difficult is it to maintain a balance of satisfying old fans who want to hear the classics, but also not wanting to seem like a nostalgia act and wanting to be seen to be looking forward?
Well, it's a balancing act, and it's if you go to play every couple of years in some cities, and particularly in Europe or the USA, places you go a lot to, then you've obviously got to make the show different every time, and so there's got to be a perhaps a 70-80% change in the set list from one year or 2 year period to the next, and so you're constantly changing and trying to. I mean, I tend to think of it as I try and break it down into styles, and I try and break it down in a temporal sense as well. So I will think of, okay, I'm going to take a song that's got I need a bluesy song from the early era, and so I'll have maybe half a dozen songs I could choose from, and I pick one of those according to what I didn't play last time I was in your town. And then similarly with something that perhaps is more of a kind of folk influence thing, I'll have a few things to choose from, and I'll pick one from certain era and a certain kind of style, and I tend to break it down that way, because in each I can then try and balance up those various things. Which era of our repertoire is it from? What style of music is it? Is it electric? Is it acoustic? Is it fast? Is it slow? I try and make sure that we don't play consecutive songs in the same key, let alone the same rhythm. You try to balance it out in a way that gives it shape and form as a concert. But it is a balancing act. There's always a degree of frustration that, in a sense, there are some songs you'd probably quite like to play that night, but they're too similar to something else you're doing, and so you think it's an either or rather than having them both together.
And just before I let you go, Ian, what's on the horizon? Anything with regard to new material, studio material from the band or yourself?
We recorded some new music last year prior to starting all the busy stuff in 2007, and unfortunately we were hoping to continue that at the end of last year, beginning of this year, but there were a couple of issues, medical issues with a couple of members of the band that precluded getting together. And most of this year, we've been working pretty hard since March onwards, and so there's not been really any opportunity to spend any time in the studio because we're usually only back home for a few days and then we go off somewhere else again. But next year there's a quieter period programmed in for 3 months at the beginning of next year, so hopefully we'll get a chance to complete some new material then. And in the meantime, it's as always, the bits of time you do have at home when you have people who, it's not like we all live in the same street. No. We live in different towns and in one case a different country, 5,000 miles away. So it's a little bit difficult just to convene people. And when you come back from a tour, the guys, understandably, they've got their commitments to their wives and children, family, friends, and you really have to. I think as you get older, you really want to, indulge in that little bit of family and sort of easy social life that perhaps in your 20s and 30s you just didn't have because you just worked all the time. But as you get older, you realize that these times are quite precious, and you won't have the opportunity for too much longer to spend that time with your children or even grandchildren. So I think there is a bit of it's become a bit sacred, that period of time between tours, where I would feel a bit of a heel if I got on the phone to the guys 2 days after we got back and said, "Listen, tell you what, I've got this great song. Can you come round tomorrow?" It wouldn't be well received.
Yeah.
But we do what we can when we can do it. But live performance tends to take the priority, I think, in terms of our music, since have always thought of ourselves as a live act primarily.
Yeah. Ian, thanks so much for being so generous with your time today. Much appreciated.
Yeah, pleasure. Nice to talk to you.
And congratulations again on the 40 years. It doesn't look like the 40th anniversary tour is going to make its way down here, but maybe year 41 we might get you down here. Well,
we get periodic offers, as I'm sure everybody knows, without me having to tell them. It is an awful long way to go with band and crew and equipment and all the rest of it. And there is a point where it's rather like, I just had to tell our South American promoter yesterday that I couldn't come to play Latin America in whenever it was, April next year or something, because apart from the fact that I have some other concerts in that month already scheduled for the UK, it's just an awful long way to go for, quite frankly, by the time you build in the travel days and the in between cities, because it's a huge country, you just actually end up with being a long way from home for a long time and only playing 5 concerts, and basically by the time you paid everybody for all those extra days of travel and hassle, and it's nobody's heart's really in it to spend so much precious time doing relatively a little. And I guess, for us living in Europe, we can always hop on the train or the plane or the bus and hit 6 shows straight and be back home, or in an ideal world, to play Friday, Saturday, Sunday, come home Monday morning and have 3 nights at home in your own bed, and then go off to work again for the long weekend. I mean, that's what I would love to do. Yeah. Unfortunately, I can't zip in for the weekend to do a couple of shows in Sydney. Yeah, no. At least not without having a carbon footprint the size of New Jersey.
Perfectly understandable. Anyway, Ian, thanks a lot.
All right, nice to talk to you.
Good, and we'll keep our fingers crossed we do get you down here one day soon anyway.
Well, we'll see how it goes.
You never know.
Fantastic.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Bye-bye.
Bye.